I'm so glad to be here with you guys today talking about this. I know that this is a hard issue and this has been a hard year, and most of us are just tired of learning and thinking and changing and absorbing all of these challenges. I totally get that. And right now, you know, even as the pandemic is coming, sort of like we see the light at the end of the tunnel, these issues around race are really, threatening to kind of tear our society apart at the seams. And so I know that this raises a lot of anxiety for people. It raises anxiety for people of color because of some of the frustrations and just, it's too mild a word, kind of the outrages that they've experienced. And it's upsetting for a lot of white people who just feel like, I'm not a racist. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is everybody angry at me? I get all this, and we're going to talk about it. And I want to be able to actually address two questions today. The first question is, why are we talking about this at all? Right? Isn't this just a political debate? I mean, our authority, it's not like NPR or the New York Times. It's the Bible. So what do we care about what the secular people are worried about? And, our goal isn't to, become hip or become woke. Our goal is to see God's will done on earth as it is in heaven, right? So why are we kind of spending so much energy as a Christian school talking about race? That's the first question I want to look at. The second question I want to ask is, why do you bring a white guy in to talk about race? Surely there are lots of people of color who thought much more about this. And so, why is it we have a white guy here to talk about racism? Isn't that actually an example of the problem? We're going to talk about that. All right. Answer the first question. So, my church, as you had mentioned, has been talking about this quite a lot. I think everybody was sort of okay with it for the first few weeks after the George Floyd murder, but kind of then people thought we'd move on. And in fact, if anything, we've been moving the opposite direction. We've been talking about this more and more and more as we just are seeing with greater clarity how insidious some of this is. And so it's been, I think, encouraging for some people. I think it's been challenging for a lot of people. I think it's been enlightening for some people. For a lot of folks, it's just been exhausting. And so I started hearing a refrain sometime kind of early this winter. I started just hearing it more and more often from a few wonderful people who just say, hey, gosh, this is great what you're trying to do, but really, why can't we just preach the Bible? Now, I love the Bible. So that is a wonderful suggestion. I just want to preach the Bible. But reconciliation, including racial reconciliation, and justice, including racial justice, is what the Bible's all about. I'm going through one of these Bible in a year reading plans. I'm sure many of you have done that. And so I'm just going beginning to end like normal. And it's been fascinating for me this year, starting in Genesis, just now that I've got this lens sort of kind of at the front of all of my sets of lenses, the questions I'm asking, I'm shocked how much, even in the early parts of the Old Testament, race, ethnicity comes up as an issue. You start to see how frequently racial righteousness is demanded throughout the Old Testament. And, all that talk about foreigners, most of that is actually talk about people of other ethnic groups, right? There's racism there, and God is addressing it and saying, Israel, you're going to be different than the rest of the world is about this. The vision of heaven that we get in Isaiah 25, right? It's one of the first beautiful visions of heaven. And God says through Isaiah, on this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all people. This is like a pretty unusual thing. Most folks in the Canaanite religions, their God cared about them. Well, it was very clear, and it starts back in Genesis, but it's all the way through and so pronounced in the prophets. God cares about everybody. God cares about those who aren't them. God cares about those who are against them. That's a really different approach to thinking about God than any of the surrounding religions had. But of course, I know we're Christians, so we don't spend as much time in the Old Testament. We spend more time in the New Testament. Well, think about how often Jesus's ministry reaches out to Samaritans, right? A lot of ethnic tensions between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people.
Should I bring my ear things or no?
You probably need the ear things. And then just being playful with you, the Gentiles. Jesus is talking to a centurion and saying he's the example of faith. Who's the first evangelist that we meet in the Bible? Well, that Jesus sends out to share the gospel. It's a Samaritan woman. Never would that have happened with any other rabbi, right? They would never have spoken to a person like that, much less exalted them to this kind of position. We keep seeing this as a part of Jesus's ministry. Acts, the book of Acts, just where the church began, that's where it now comes front and center, right? The Holy Spirit fills the church for the very first time as evidence to give evidence that God is present there among them. We end up having this miraculous ability of people from different ethnicities, and it's emphasized how many different ethnic groups are there gathered in Jerusalem when all suddenly this happens. And finally, for the first time since Babel, they understand each other. Pentecost is the undoing of Babel. Just like the fall and the crucifixion and the resurrection were the undoing of the fall, Pentecost is the undoing of Babel. And so we start to see that these people of all these different ethnicities are talking to each other for the first time, understanding each other, being reconciled. We then start to see one of the very first challenges that the young church had in Acts 6. It was dealing with their racial conflict. This is the major theme that we see running throughout all of Acts. In chapter 10, right, another great move of the Holy Spirit, and it overturns Israel's established racial hierarchy. And it taught Peter that, in contrast to, kind of his longstanding bigotry, God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation, ethnus, right? Ethnicity, from every ethnicity, the one who fears him and does what is right. We just keep seeing this go through the entire New Testament. If you look at Paul's letters, there's only a couple that don't have one of the key themes being racial reconciliation. Now, we don't notice it as racial reconciliation because we think, well, racial, it's black and white, and what are they? They are different ethnic groups. They're having tensions, and the fruit of the kingdom is these coming together. And the thing that really would have threatened to undermine the church in its earliest years was they're moving back into their ethnic competition, their ethnic hierarchies, all of that kind of stuff. So this runs all throughout the New Testament. And then finally, the very end of the New Testament, Revelation, we get this vision again of what heaven's going to look like. In chapter 7, verse 9 says, "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation," again, ethnus, ethnicity, from every ethnicity, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. The vision of what heaven looks like isn't just us being reconciled with God. It's us being reconciled with each other. That is what the Bible is about. So I'm happy to just preach the Bible, but that's what's going to make us talk a whole lot more about racism. In fact, when you start looking at how regularly this is in the Bible, the real question is not, why are we talking so much about race? The question is, why have we heard so little about it in most evangelical churches until recently? I just wonder if we've allowed our devotion to our own comfort, to the status quo, to the privilege that a lot of us enjoy, to allow us to filter which parts of God's word that we've listened to. Indeed, if Christians had been preaching the Bible more faithfully over the past decades and centuries, we probably wouldn't be in the mess that we're in today. So I get it that we have been in a hard year. Pandemic has been very difficult. There's a lot of things that have been really hard about this. I get it that people are tired. But as depleting as this race conversation is for some people in the Veritas community, I understand why it is. The lack of honest conversation about it over the past 400 years in America has been devastating for other Veritas families, whom I know you love. So although it kind of feels heavy, I really do believe that conversations like the one we're trying to have today are the work of Jesus. We are doing the work of Jesus. We are seeing God's will done on earth as it is in heaven. That is the vision that I have. So that brings me to the second question I want to jump in with. Uh, why ask a white guy to come talk about racism? Part of the problem with white supremacy is we ask white guys to talk about everything. And white guys are going to talk about everything, whether you ask them or not, because we believe that everybody wants to hear what we have to say. And we're the ones who are the authorities on kind of every subject, including racism. So if some of you are a little bit suspicious, I get it. I think I'm with you. I think you're right on that. But I think there's actually can be some value. Ultimately, I don't think I'm the best expert. I think we're going to find a lot of people of color who are way down in terms of the maturity of the way that they think about this and name some of these things and can challenge us and speak truth right from the scriptures. I think we're going to find a lot of people of color who can do that. But maybe having a conversation like this start with a white guy isn't such a bad idea, because after all, it's the white guys like me who have been creating and sustaining these unjust systems for all of this time in America, because they work so well for us. It works for me. All of us, and I literally mean all of us on this call, regardless of all of us in America have been complicit in this system in various ways, different ways that we've all been complicit. But it's not people of color who are enforcing this system. It's the white people. I think a second reason maybe that I might be helpful here is that I grew up not seeing these things. I grew up in Concord. We only had one Black family that had a kid that was my age, and he was one of my close friends, and he and I were roommates together every year at summer camp. So I just kind of thought, look, we don't have a racial problem. There are a number of Asian kids. We all got along. We kind of thought they were white. We didn't really think much about it. Racism just wasn't an issue. I mean, I know it was an issue back in slavery. That was awful. But, Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, that's over. Well, I guess it wasn't all the way over. Then there's Martin Luther King. Now it's over. And now we've got this wonderful post-racial society, and we just love each other. That's kind of how I saw things as I was growing up. And so it was hard for me to understand when people complain about racism, because I just never saw it. And it was not a part of my own heart. And I actually feel like that is what a lot of us think and what gets us in trouble. I actually grew up with what a lot of people think is the goal is just kind of being colorblind. We just don't really pay much attention to color. But what I actually think that means in practice, what I've learned that it means is that we've learned to pretend not to notice that certain people among us are not white. We're going to give them the privilege of pretending not to notice and just giving them honorary white status for a little while when they're around us. And we think we're being so welcoming. And I feel like at churches, this is exactly what we do. We end up having people come in, so long as they don't bring their ethnicity with them. Bring your skin, that's fine. Don't bring your culture. That's when it sort of becomes obnoxious. And so long as you're willing to act white, or at least sort of like accept our way of doing things, we're glad to have you. And we think of that as really gracious and welcoming. But what it ends up doing is actually diminishing people. You can imagine if I were to say, hey, I just don't see gender. I just treat women like they're men. A lot of you might not find that all that appealing, right? No, I actually feel like there's something I have to contribute because I'm a woman. There's a different experience that I have that actually will bring them to certain conversations. I see things differently than you do, Dave, because I'm a woman. I don't want to be that you'll, have the idea that you'll pretend that I'm male. I'm not male. And I think that that's a benefit here. And the same thing is true with people of color. They don't want us to pretend not to notice that they don't have their own background and story and culture. In fact, because of that background and story and culture, they can bring something that we can't bring. So we want to be able to invite people in fully. I just did not see that growing up because I thought everybody wanted to be white. I mean, not white skin. I just thought white culture. And that's the problem that we have and as I say we, I mean, I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody, more than myself. We have this idea that white is right. The way we do things, it's the way to do things, right? What's the best music? Well, of course, it's classical music, European white music. We have this idea on everything. And so the white way becomes the right way. And And then we just assume everybody wants to do it the right way. And we don't really stop to question, well, why is it that other people would do a different way? And in fact, maybe there's some things that we could learn that are better from doing it that way. But I think that sense of the normativity of whiteness, the normativity of our culture, that I think is what ends up being so oppressive to so many people. That's at least a piece of it. I want to talk about how I started to see things a little bit differently. I grew up, again, my grandmother was the town manager for the town of Concord, Board of Selectmen, and so she kind of, the police would come down our house, our neighborhood. She lived next door all the time because they had to deliver her stuff. My father was the town council for Concord. So I had pretty clear understanding, like I thought everybody had, the police work for me, right? That protect and serve. And what they mean, that protect and serve us, me. And so I always thought the police were just fantastic. Only it had positive experiences. And then you hear all these like arguments, brutality, but there has to be another story going on there, because I know a lot of police people and they're not like that at all. They're super nice. They would only be violent if there was a problem and somebody needed to have that. Like that was just the only reason, only reasonable response that cop could have had, because that had been my experience. Then I ended up adopting 7 Black kids. And through them, I started to see an entirely different world. It was a million little things along the way, but the one that was sort of the most jarring for me happened when one of my sons first got his license, and he was driving around and doing great. And one day he calls me from the Mass Pike, and he's driving home on the Mass Pike, and he got rear-ended by a woman in a Subaru who's talking on his telephone, and she whacks him in the back and kind of spins him out into the guardrail and kind of damages his car. He doesn't know what to do. So he calls me. He says, what do I do? I said, hey, no problem. I'm going to be right there. Nobody's hurt. That's fine. A woman came over. She apologized. She hadn't been paying attention. She was really sorry. All this kind of stuff. I said, don't worry. I'm on my way. And on my way, I called the state police, because police always help. And that was, of course, my natural reaction, because they always help people like me. And so we get down there, and by the time I'm there, my son's the only one left. And what ended up happening is the cop comes, talks to my son and says, hey, what happened here? And my son starts to explain what happened. And he goes, I can't understand. You don't even speak English. My son does speak English. He just has an accent. But be quiet. And he goes back, talks to the white woman, has her leave. Then comes back in and says that he was driving recklessly and gives him a ticket. Well, he got rear-ended. It really, what are you talking about? But apparently he was not driving fast enough. It ended up being the argument that the officer had. And so we thought, well, this is just insane. So we said, we're going to go to court with this. And we go to court, and my son, is asked a few questions, gives us answers. And then the judge says, asked the cop what happened, and the cop gives a very different story. And we're all like, this is just crazy. And so that's not at all what happened, right? We got hit from the rear. And the judge looks at my son and says, are you calling this officer a liar? Well, I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to tell you what happened. And so then he threatens him with contempt for calling the officer a liar for telling a story that was false. And I had just never seen this kind of thing. And I was so upset and so angry. I was like, I don't get it. And I ended up telling one of my Black friends about this that next day. And he got angry at me. I just had never experienced anything like this before, but he started to yell at me. And he said, you called the cops on your Black son. I said, no, I didn't call them on my Black. I called them for my Black son. And he was furious that someone as stupid as I would be entrusted with Black children. He said, don't you know you put your kid's life in danger? You can't. And I thought, what are these people talking about? It had never been my experience. Since then, it's become my experience. And I started to see this kind of thing all the time. And so I get it when I see people, you read about Michael Brown, you think, oh, I think he was running, I'm sure that kid was looking threatening. All these excuses that we've made. And they always had sounded reasonable to me. Now I know these stories, the other side of them, realize that's not what's happening at all. But we haven't been able to see that. And I feel like we've allowed this kind of oppression to continue on in our culture in a way that I don't think a lot of us know exists. 2 weeks ago. No, that's not true. 4 weeks ago, my that same son actually was driving. He helped a friend. He brought him to church on Sunday, and then was bringing him home. It got him on COVID test. Driving home on Sunday afternoon, middle of the day, going down Route 93 and Route 3, and was pulled over by a police officer who followed him for 15 miles, and finally pulls him over right at the border. Okay, well now we've been pulled over a lot. My son gets pulled over coming out of our neighborhood because it's a white neighborhood. And so then the officers come over and say, hey, what are you doing here? And I live here. And we just had this experience over and over again. And each time he gets the message, you're not really one of us. You're not really an American. He is an American. He's got a passport. But that's the message we keep getting. So finally he gets pulled over again just 4 weeks ago. It happens all the time. And so he does all the right things. He gets his registration out, puts his license and registration on the dash. He puts his hands, 10 and 2, or puts his hands flat on the dash, rolls down his window, and waits for the cop to come. And the police officer comes up, puts a gun against his temple and starts screaming at him. Opens up the car door, yanks my son out, throws him on the ground, puts a knee in his back. Thanks be to God, I think partly because of all the stuff that's been on TV, we had 5 white folks who ended up stopping their cars because they could all sense something was out of control. And my son is pretty convinced that they saved his life. And then another police officer arrived and told the first one, hey, you're kind of out of hand here. But then in order to save face, they charged him with a driving under the influence. He had not been drinking. He had been at church. There was no evidence. He asked for a breathalyzer test. The cop refused to give it. And I just started to see, and then they towed his car, which cost $370. Well, they end up later offering to drop the charges, but he still had to pay for the car, and then he'd have to pay for a court fee to go for the meeting. It was $60. The average Black man in the greater Boston area has $8. That's their net worth. And my son just got charged $420 plus a bunch of other fees just because some cop was frustrated that there was somebody like him on the road. And this kind of thing sets up these cycles that a lot of us aren't seeing. And I think that's why it's so important that we're talking about this, is we're allowing these certain stories not to come to the surface. So we just don't know that they're there. I think a lot of Christians would hear any of this and go, that's outrageous. What we don't understand is it's happening all the time. 3 people of color are killed by police every day. We get videos on a few, but 3 people a day, every day, are being killed by police. And you can imagine what it's like when you're going through life, always knowing that you are vulnerable, always knowing that you could be threatened. But it's not just police. It's actually much bigger than that. And most of it isn't these dramatic big things. It's a million small things. So one of there's a study at MIT a number of years ago in which they ended up taking a bunch of resumes, like 1,000 resumes, and made 2 versions of them that were exactly the same. The only difference is they decided on the first 1,000, they were going to put white sounding names. On the second 1,000, they put black sounding names. And they sent them out to employers, just response to different jobs. And the white students or the white job applicants, white sounding, because they're all just made up, the white sounding applicants got way more requests for interviews. Well, why is that? Do you think these companies are against Black people? Of course not. They all love Black people. But what we end up having is this implicit bias. We just somehow, we assume, and this is baked into all of us, and this is where I feel like the racism, none of us feel like we're racist. We're just a part of these racist systems. We end up having the Black people kind of go, oh, I think this white one sounds like a stronger candidate, because of these racial biases that we bring into these conversations that we're unaware of. And that ends up being the way that we have these systems of oppression that go on and on and on. And all of us end up treating people of color differently, especially Black men are seen as threats. They're seen as threats. Black women are not believed as much when they explain that they have pain at hospitals. They're not given as much medicine because it's not believed that they're really in as much pain. They're just being dramatic. My daughter just gave birth. It's kind of exciting. We was just up there for the birth on Monday night, Tuesday morning, really. And every time I leave the hospital and come back, she actually asked me every time there's a shift change for me to be there of the nurses, because she's starting to see that she gets treated so differently if I'm there versus when I'm not there. And this is what's happening everywhere, every day. Um, my kids are all in a store. They're all together. They come out, and the black kids are asked, "Hey, can I see your bag?" All my kids were together, but it's never the white kids that get asked that. We just have these experiences all the time. I've got two sons who are both now 21, both wonderful kids. But we all know everyone's got a different personality. And so one of them is the more kind of like hardworking, studious, super disciplined. The other one is the more just like gregarious, kind of like, hey, kind of, well, the details will figure themselves out. Honestly, if I were working at if I were hiring people for a minimum wage job, I'd really want the first one. But the first one's black, the second one is white. They're exactly the same age. They both got a job at McDonald's at the same time. And my white son, who is having a harder time catching up to all the things, he got shifts every single time we requested them. My black son finally just quit because he would never get scheduled. And what was the reason for that? I think we know, but let's imagine it's not. The problem, I think one of the challenges that some people of color are having to experience every day that the rest of us don't think about is wondering, did that weird look I just got, I think I got that weird look. Is that because I'm black? Is that because I'm Asian? I never wonder if I got a weird look or if I didn't get the shift because I'm white. It just never happens. And so I just want you to, the reason I'm telling you all this, I want you to see that the experience, the daily lived experience that white people are having is really different than the daily lived experience that especially black people, all people of color, but especially black people are coming from. And so given that we've learned to treat people differently, you see people differently, why is it that a teenager, a 12-year-old playing in a park is perceived to be a threat by an officer who shoots him? Because he looks dangerous. But he looks dangerous because we've decided that black people are dangerous looking, and then we treat them that way. But all of this is part of this implicit bias that is affecting every possible interaction. And all this really comes down to this caste system that we have in America that is a part of the basic foundation of everything in our society, but we just never talk about it. There's just a simple caste system where white people are on top, and then it actually goes down where black people are put onto the bottom, and then people of color are in different spaces in between. And so people who are white end up having all this power, people who are black don't. And sorry, I'm getting lots and lots of calls here. There we go. So the problem with whiteness, a lot of people feel like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not racist. I can't help that I was born with this color skin. Whiteness, when people talk about the problem with whiteness, they're not actually talking about anybody's skin color, right? It's fine to have light skin or dark skin. That's kind of irrelevant. The whole idea of whiteness is this system that ends up putting people who have lighter skin in power and disempowering people who deviate from the white model. That ends up being what whiteness is about. And it ends up, people will use violence in order to maintain this system of superiority, right? A lot of this is not violent at all. Yeah, it's that white is white, white is right. One of my friends at our church, when she was a college student, she worked at a summer camp, and she's Asian, she's Korean, and she's gorgeous. I mean, she's just one of these kind of striking people. But when there's a little girl in her group, her little camper group, who also was Korean, but she had been adopted by white parents like me, and so she was kind of going around and in the group, and finally she asked my friend, why don't you have blonde hair? And my Korean friend said to this Korean little girl, well, because I'm Korean, like you. She goes, oh, but you're so nice. I thought if you're really nice, you get the blonde hair. Well, I'm sure nobody ever told this girl that. But what she'd done is seen her whole life where all the princesses were white, they're all blonde, right? All the models of beauty were all based on what whiteness looks like. And so what she had learned is there's something defective about her. That's all that kind of shows up in all the other, lots of other places where we think white is the standard. It's interesting that when we do history classes, usually what we mean is white history. We talk about, all through Europe and all that. Very rarely do we get as much information on what was happening in China at the time, or India at the time, or throughout Africa at the time. We just don't get those kinds of stories because when we're talking about history, we only end up focusing on white history because it's the one that matters. These are those little assumptions that we just don't pay attention to, but that get baked in and communicate a lot. And it forms people's sense of in or out. And so, we tell the story of American history. What we usually mean is European American history, because we don't usually tell the story of the native people who are here unless, we're going to have a little special thing about on Thanksgiving, in which case they loved being at the table. They're so glad to be invited. We don't usually tell the story of the slaves, except as this one blot that happened back then, but we don't talk then about Jim Crow. We don't talk about the ongoing oppression. Just so many stories end up getting written out of the narrative in order for us to tell the story of white people. But then we're not really telling the whole story, and it is a subtle form of racism. And it ends up being exclusionary to people and marginalizing. So I think that the whole idea, again, that I'm not bad for being white. You're not bad for being white. There's nothing wrong with being pale-skinned. We're bad if we are unaware of the way that we're complicit in systems that privilege certain people and oppress others. That's where we get in trouble. And I think it's what we do all the time. One of the responses I hear the most often when white people would talk about this is, hey, I didn't have any white privilege. I grew up poor and, I had to work for everything I got. And I don't doubt that you worked super hard. But and maybe also even say, hey, my ancestors didn't even own slaves either. I could go back. We did the 23andMe and went back. No slave owners that I'm aware of in my family history. Great, I'm so glad. But that doesn't mean that you didn't benefit directly from that trade. So my parents, right? We don't have that we've been able to find any kind of history of slave owners. So I guess we're not the ones who created the problem. Except that my dad bought a house in Concord back in the 70s for $17,000. He sold it about 4 years ago, for about $1.2 million. But he was allowed to buy that house and he got a government loan for it. A black family would not have been allowed to purchase that same house and would not have gotten the loan, right? Redlining. They weren't allowed they wouldn't give loans in a bunch of neighborhoods, predominantly the black neighborhoods. And oftentimes realtors wouldn't sell homes to black people in white neighborhoods because they wanted to keep the values high, property values high. So as a result, my family got $1 million of wealth. We didn't really have to work very hard for, but it was not available to black families. That's a tremendous kind of privilege that we just don't usually think about. We don't notice it, but the ability to have these capital gains. My father then was an attorney, charged $700 an hour. How does somebody pay $700 an hour? Where do people get this wealth? Actually, a lot of the wealth that white people have nowadays is a direct result of the slave trade. You think, oh, no, I'm not from Oklahoma. I'm not from the South. Like the slaves are in the South. That's actually true-ish. There were more slaves in the South. There were slaves all throughout the North as well, but in fewer numbers. And the emancipation movement started earlier in the North. That part's true. But the real money from slavery was not made in the South. It was made in the North. Who built all of the ships that were built for the slave trade? Well, they're all built in New England. Who financed all of these operations? That, it costs a lot of money. You build a ship, send a crew, you travel for months and months and months, and then, you have to go and do this whole triangle trade. You guys are familiar with that. Who paid for that? It's all financed by people in New England. We were the ones who were making the money. We are capitalizing on the trade in humans. And so why is there so much concentrated wealth in New England? Why are the best universities, the most endowed universities in New England? It's actually all directly a result of the slave trade. We end up having all these advantages. So even though my family personally, we don't have a record of anybody enslaving people, we are now part of a community that has lots of money, and therefore my dad can charge money because these people would pay. That was all generated by slaves, but slaves didn't get to have a share in. They didn't get the to kind of grow that over centuries the way that white people have. So I think that, a lot of people think, oh, I had to really work hard. I think everybody has to work hard. You can imagine this illustration. We're in a running race. It's a mile long race. And, I go to the starting line and I run my heart out and I win the race. I'd be so proud of myself. Well, you can imagine that would be a really great race if everybody else started at the finish line with me. But what if the people of color, what if the Asian Americans had to start a half mile behind me? That doesn't mean they can't win, right? Somebody might be a lot faster than I am. They could still win. What if the black people had to start a mile back? So they had to run twice as fast as me. It doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to win. It just means that it's going to be a lot easier for me to win. And that's been the nature of privilege. I don't have as many obstacles, partly because I'm white, partly because I'm male, partly because I have access to education. I have an intact family. There's a million privileges that I have. And every one of those things that you're not in America is another ding against you. And so you end up having these people who are then excluded from the sort of mythological American dream. They're just not being allowed participation in it. Well, I think that this is complex for Asians, and we have a lot of Asians at Veritas, and I think this is worth kind of thinking about. Isabel Wilkerson writes this just a masterpiece called Caste, C-A-S-T-E, which I really recommend everybody read. I think it's one of the most important American books right now in print. And so, but she describes this caste system, and she explains, how the kind of the details and the history and how it works. It's a brilliant way to start to see our own society and decode all the messages that were right there in plain sight. You just never saw them. Wonderful book. But then so where do Asians fit into this? They actually have this funny, complex history because Asians are brought in and given privileges that Black people are not in America, but not given the full privileges of white people. So basically what happens is in times when, when everything's going really well, economy's robust, we end up giving Asians very high status, and they're allowed to have a lot of the privileges that white people have. But as soon as you can go back into the 1800s with the Chinese Exclusion Act, so many different, the internment of Japanese families during the war, so many of these times when there's insecurity or instability in America or the economy wobbles, racism against Asians, anti-Asian racism suddenly spikes. Every time, because then white people are now trying to re-exert privilege when now it feels like there's scarcity. And so it ends up that Asian people are in this funny place where it's awkward to talk about racism because, well, they're going to be told by Black people, you don't have as bad as us. And that's true. But I mean, I think it's worth saying, if you got shot and I got kicked in the face, I mean, yeah, getting shot's worse. But am I not allowed to complain about getting kicked in the face? Am I not allowed to complain about getting teased all the time because, I have the wrong eyes, which happens all the time to Asian people. When my church is predominantly Asian. When I was walking down the street with my associate pastor right in the very beginning, and I started being shocked by how often people would just yell, "Go back home," or, "Hey, chink," or all these we just heard it all the time. I had never known that was happening because nobody ever yells those things at me. And so we end up leaving these things untouched. And that's why I think it's really important we talk about this. My real point here today is, I know a lot of you have really, really like pure hearts about this. Just think, I'm not a racist. I don't see racism. I don't think this is that big a problem. It's not a big problem for you. But it is a daily difficulty, a daily burden, a deadly burden in some cases for many other people. And so being silent about it is really painful for a lot of people that we care about. And I think we're not telling these kinds of stories. We're not normalizing them. We don't believe them when we hear them. We kind of poo-poo them. And as a result, a lot of people end up feeling more marginalized because we're not willing to embrace all of their stories and hear all of that. And why does this matter? Coming back to my first question, as Christians, it matters because Jesus said, they're going to know that you're my disciples by your love for one another. Well, if some people in our group are at much greater threat of being murdered by the police, of being excluded economically, of not being given jobs, of being teased, of being told that they're not as good as. If a bunch of people in our community are having that experience regularly, and the rest of us are ignoring it, the rest of us aren't hearing and having compassion and aren't doing something to rectify it, I don't think we can be saying that we're loving each other, right? We're supposed to bear each other's burdens. And I don't know that we're doing that when we marginalize these stories. So I think this is a part of our commandment to love. I also think it's a part of this vision that God has to see the kind of the sinful break of ethnic racism be undone in God's kingdom. And so if we're going to be, this little outpost, this kind of first taste of heaven on earth, that's what the church is supposed to be. Well, then we need to look like what heaven looks like. And what heaven looks like is, first of all, diverse. I remember, this is interesting. When I went to Korea for the first time, I remember being shocked because I always thought, white is normal. And, there are a few Koreans. I got to Korea and I realized, oh yeah, their main city is twice the size of New York City. There's way more of them. And Asians, there's going to be way more Asians in heaven. Think about this, way more Asians in heaven than white people. I mean, if the Lord comes soon, and just looking at what history has been, there are going to be way more Asian people in heaven than there are white people. The most evangelized Christian nation, continent on earth, Africa, right? The kingdom is these people. These are our brothers and sisters, and we need to then be able to take their story seriously. Once I went to Korea and I started to see this, I realized, man, our culture, I think of something that's old is like 300 years. It gets a plaque if somebody had a house that's 300 years old here in New England. In Korea, an old house is 1,200 years old, right? In Japan, there's a business that's been around for more than one family for 1,000 years. We just don't have anything like that in America. These cultures have had time to work out a lot of details, and there's beauty and wisdom in that we could be learning from. So I'd love for the church, including Veritas, to be this taste of the kingdom. I want to leave with one final note, and then any kind of questions or pushback, all that's fine. One final note, I think diversity, to me, is not the goal. So often what ends up happening in diversity is we want people who think and act just like me, but look different. We call it diversity. What we want is multiculturalism. It's not just allowing people of different skin tones to be together while my culture dominates. It's being able to recognize that my culture is just one of the cultures. And there's nothing wrong with my culture, any more than any other. All cultures have merits and all of them have weaknesses. All of us can grow and learn. So having a multicultural community would mean that we really take seriously the cultures, the stories, the values that are different than the ones that we grew up with. We hear these kinds of things. And so that my children would come home from Veritas, my Black sons who attend Veritas would come home feeling proud of who they are, because sometimes we're telling, and not just on February, sometimes we're telling stories about great Black innovators, great Black leaders. Augustine, where he lived? Anybody? Hippo? It's in Africa, right? Ambrose, Africa. The fathers of the church were in Africa. We don't ever tell those stories. The first big Christian empire, everybody knows, it's Rome. It's not Rome. The first one was Ethiopia. These are the stories, though, that none of us ever hear. And as a result, white people seem like the right ones. And my children walk away with the story that, oh, we're good too. Rather than saying, there's something so beautiful about the culture that I'm a part of. And I'm a gift. I'm created in God's image, just like you are. I've got sins in my culture, just like you do. We're all on equal footing. And that's where real honor and dignity can happen. And I think that would be a goal. More than diversity, it would be that kind of multicultural experience.